Hello and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. This is Joseph Bohigian returning to your feeds with a special bonus episode, a recording of the pre-concert talk by musicologist Simon Morrison at our concert of the complete piano sonatas of 20th century Russian composer Galina Ustvolskaya, performed by Conor Hanick. Simon Morrison is a professor of music at Princeton University, specializing in 20th century Russian and Soviet music. In the recording, you'll hear Morrison discuss Ustvolskaya's life, her relationships with her contemporaries, and her 6 piano sonatas composed between 1947 and 1988. After the episode, head over to the Other Minds website, otherminds.org, where you can watch a video of Conor Hanick's performance of Galina Ustvolskaya's piano sonatas at the Freight Salvage in Berkeley, California.
Well, good evening, everybody, and again, it's an honor to be here with Conor and to be treated to these incredible compositions. So I'm going to talk about her, which is not easy to do given how defiant she was of people like me talking about her. So we can start off with basic facts. She lived from 1919 to 2006 in the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. That was her world, that was her threshold, the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. This means that when she was a teenager and when she was a young adult, existence was defined by very repressive politics and a very suffocating ideology, that of Stalinism. Russia then and now is an aristocracy. It's also an idiocracy. That is to say, it's a place that has at different points viewed itself as being on a messianic mission, has promoted ideologies and belief systems that don't have a lot of respect for individuals. Some of these abstract concepts that govern that place then and now made little human or economic sense, but controlled the lives of well over 100 million people, including Ustvolskaya's life. So the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation is, again, an idiocracy. This place has produced and continues to produce really great artists, and most of them are humanists in defiance of these abstract concepts. And a lot of these artists resisted the people in charge. In pursuit of abstract concepts like communism, the people running Russia and the Soviet Union had a bad habit of inverting and negating human values. And those rulers also marshaled artists and art in the service of power, and they turned art into propaganda. And composers of Ustvolskaya's time, including Ustvolskaya herself, were tasked with the representation of Marxist-Leninist ideas and all things bright and beautiful and Soviet. And they were told that they needed to tell stories in their music. And she told stories in her music early on, and then she stopped doing so. She turned inward. She didn't retreat. She wasn't a dissident, despite all the stuff you'll read. She turned inward, and she began to write music that affronted the norms of Soviet composition. And so some people, then and now, described her music as being anti-musical, which is a strange thing to say, even nihilistic. And in Russia, there are 2 trends, the apocalyptic and the nihilistic, and the apocalyptic is positive. Russian Revolution, right? Nihilistic. And there was actually an ontological aspect to her denial. Her music was seen as anti-narrative, so it's not telling political stories. It's anti-historical, it's not about the past. It's anti-moral, it's anti-value, it's anti-memory, it's anti-recall, it's anti-time, it's anti-space. A lot of anti. And I'll say that if Ustvolskaya's music had a point of reference, it's a really strange one. It's the contrapuntal technique and choral textures of the Lutheran composer Johann Sebastian Bach. And Johann Sebastian Bach believed some tough things about us. He thought that reason was a trap. And he thought that life was pain. Now, if she were with us and I said, Bach, she would say no. She would deny that point of reference because she denied all points of reference. She composed a symphony early on that included texts about racism and economic injustices in these United States. And then she said that the symphony had nothing to do with the United States. She wrote, Zapad Ameriki ne pričam. Basically, it has nothing to do with it, despite the text in question. She actually gave her works religious titles like Dies Irae, and then she said they weren't religious. Although she did say that God was in charge of the ship. This was somebody who wanted to eviscerate context. And so in the act of evisceration, her music became increasingly brutal is a word you can use. Obsessive. The music of someone who maybe can't escape their own mind. Dark stuff. So I've detained our artist who's humoring me here, pianist Conor Hanick, to ask him to demonstrate a couple of passages from her sonatas. It's her choice. And this is a sample of what we consider to be an obsessive repetition. Tough for pianists to perform. She also works a lot with pitch clusters, groups of a dissonant gathering of clumps of sound. Thank you, Conor.
More where that comes from.
More when that comes from. Now we can talk. All right. One thing you're going to notice during this concert is, as you got a sense of there, the intense concentratedness, if that's a word, of Ustvolskaya's music. Yeah? Everything is essential. Everything is a point of focus. Everything has a place. No fluff, no extraneousness, no decorative detail. And in her first piano sonata of the six, she actually moves from one point of musical obsession, if I can use that word, to another. This sonata is cast in 4 movements, so you're dealing with 4 nodes of concentration. In the last sonata, which is in a single movement, there is but one point of obsession, which is the pitch clusters. So she moves in her 6 piano sonatas to a focus on a bunch of musical objects, to a couple of musical objects, to perhaps just one musical object. And that which is cerebral becomes very primal and very visceral. And so what you get is a movement from the frontal lobe, if you want, to the sort of hind brain. And yet, even as we reach a place where there's a lot of negation and conventional musical values are negated, there are moments of poignancy and tenderness. You'll hear them. She didn't want her music to lose human presence, human force. She did not want it to become a menacing, mechanical thing. That's what those people were up to. In a socio-political context that emphasized bigness, Ustvolskaya went small. And she accommodated smallness, tininess, also insufficiency. It's never loud enough, it's never quiet enough. Lopsidedness, doubt, fragility, very human. So what I'm going to do is tell you who she was and how she got to this place. She lived most of her life in the city of Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. She married twice. She taught for a living at the Rimsky-Korsakov College of Music, which was kind of the prep school for the Leningrad Conservatory. She produced eminent students, though she was said to have been almost abusively controlling of their activities. She had an affair with Dmitry Shostakovich because Shostakovich was a skirt chaser who had affairs with lots of people. She found his music depressing. I do. She denied being influenced by him. Now, when you listen to her first piano concerto, which I do recommend, you hear very much the sort of scoring of his first piano concerto. But I would say that going through it all, it's fair to say that she had a greater influence on him than he did on her. But of course, misogyny being misogyny, etc., that's not talked about in his case, but it's always talked about in hers. She wrote about 40 big pieces. She allowed 20 of them to remain in her recording catalog, into her public catalog, so she suppressed several pieces from early on in her career. 25 pieces she approved for performance and publication, 16 of them post-date 1953, which means post-dating Stalin's death. So her career more properly belongs to what we call the thaw, post-Stalinist period under Nikita Khrushchev, and also to the zastoy, the stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev, and his immediate successors, Yuri Andropov, Konstantin Chernenko, all of these nice people. And her last compositions date from the Gorbachev era, from the Glasnost period, which is the twilight of Soviet power. Her music has always had a bigger audience outside of Russia than inside of Russia. Inside of Russia, she's a niche kind of artist. She's considered an anti-classical classic, if you can bear that paradox. She's likened sometimes to Schnitke or Sofia Gubaidulina. Her music is performed at conservatories and at festivals of late and postmodern music, but most of them outside of Russia rather than inside. And Russian critics have actually looked at this and have wondered whether or not our fascination with her, the boom, will last. Since the 1980s, when she herself began to leave Russia for performances of her work, she's been grouped together with so-called mavericks, experimental iconoclastic artists who were silenced at home only to be celebrated in the concert halls of Amsterdam and Heidelberg and New York and Berkeley and other new music centers. So she's been, from our side, exoticized, romanticized, along with the entire Soviet experience. And that's proved especially appealing. The idea that there's nihilism associated with apocalypse, etc., the reclusiveness, all bound up with the idea that maybe this is a suffering soul. Her New York Times obituary seems to invoke this when it says that listening to her works, it's not a bad description, forms emerge from pitch blackness only when the eyes have become accustomed to the lack of light. It's not a bad way, because after a while you get used to these sounds and then you're in this other world with them. So the claims made reductively are that she was a victim of the Soviet cultural system. She was forced to retreat. But in the few places where she went on the record, she consistently used the language of no compromise. She was intent on carving out a space for herself, a place of power. She didn't want to be beholden to institutions, politicians. To be taken seriously on her own terms, she refused to admit outside influence. So her music was spiritual but not religious, which opens up another world. She reduced the role of her teachers, including Dmitry Sostakovich, to nothing. Another negative resides in her challenging the conventions not just of art, but our basic understanding of what art and musical art is. She early on was asked to write music for workers. Her response was to make music work, like labor, for us. She's not out to charm or delight or entertain. There's no light, there's no lightness. Yet, this is the stereotype. And the notion that Ustvolskaya's music might have happiness or humor or caprice, that the negatives might exist in the service of some sort of positive, apparently we're not allowed to talk about that. That she got drunk, that she laughed, that she traveled. She did those things, but that's not the labeling. She preferred extremes, quiet, and very, very loud things to the middle ground. She liked tuba and piccolo. She didn't like strings. She consciously positioned herself outside any and all trends. One erudite Russian interpreter actually said her music was neither conformist, orthodox, nor nonconformist. It was just simply beyond. Another equally learned scholar says that her music is terse but dense. Rhythm is sacrificed in favor of ostinato patterns. That's just not true. Ostinato patterns are little musical engines that repeat over and over again, little machines. Dynamic contrasts are exaggerated. Conventional linear development is avoided in favor of systematic expansion and contraction of melodies and the clusters anchoring them. She uses, in truth, cellular block-like constructions, recombining and reconfiguring their elements. She does invoke ancient occult beliefs to add universal content to her works. She does say that her music is about God. If that's the case, it's not the God of the New Testament, but the Old one. A God of furious fire, severe and punishing. But then there's also this kind of intimate, personal side to the scores, where even things like the physical pain in her hands at the end of her life is transferred to that and transferred to us. So there's a way in which this music communicates that's not about storytelling, but something else. On the humorous side, in terms of descriptions of her music and its repetitiveness, she's been described pretty anachronistically as a minimalist. And one reviewer anointed her, I love this, the high priestess of sado minimalism. Which suggests, I suppose, that minimalism, I guess, is happy, but except for hers. A sado-minimalism of the sort Ustvolskaya is imagined to practice turns the pleasure of repetition into an ordeal. Another scholar, a person I like named Levon Hakamian, actually said that her music's not especially friendly, like it's supposed to be some sort of poodle. And then he says it's not compatible with the aesthetic dogmas of the Soviet era. It's dissonant, it's bewitching, note that, bewitching, right? In its rhythmic ostinato and tone clusters, ostinato again, it's not. Rich in long, intense, suggestive pauses, shocking by abrupt transitions from very, very loud to very, very soft, and vice versa. And as she says, the deliberate scarcity of material is compensated by the unique, one might say, authoritarian manner of its presentation. Okay. Now, Soviet music wasn't one thing. It changed over time. And she wrote Soviet music early on. And to say that all of her music is about resistance is reductive and inaccurate. One of her biographers, a person named Simon Bachman, says that the music of Galina Ustvolskaya is an angry protest against the lack of liberty, the tyranny, and the system of dictatorship. That's what he says. Yet, her music was never banned. It was not opposed by officialdom. And it was also music that actually had a lot of points of contact with other composers and with other traditions, but she had to deny them because she did not want to be reduced by anything. Henry Cowell is a point of reference. You'll hear, if you want, bits of Debussy here. Soviet musical life in Leningrad was looser and easier than in Moscow. The Union of Soviet Composers operating in Leningrad was pretty supportive and respectful of her. So she had her stuff performed and recorded. Moscow is a slightly different story because the guy in charge there, Tikhon Khrennikov, was quite reactionary, but he didn't have much to say about her works. She just wasn't, writing operas and ballets and the kind of things that she paid attention to. So you have a sort of mixed bag in terms of her reputation even among the Soviets, so that the piano concertos are seen as promising despite the ending being too long. And then the harshest criticism of her is that she's highly promising, but there's a sort of aridity to the music. And early on in 1948, she wrote a piece called The Dream of Stepan Razin. It was a Cossack hero beloved by the Soviets, agitprop. It was nominated for the Stalin Prize in Music, which is the highest honor in the land, if you can imagine. Other pieces, she wrote a piece about a miner, like coal miner, Man from High Hill. She also wrote a pioneer suite and a children's suite, which was recorded on Melodia. She also wrote music for movies, including my favorite, Девочка с крокодилом, which is the girl and the crocodile. And she actually composed a score that's actually pretty dissonant and crazy. It's in blocks, but they're interesting blocks. Some of them are tonal, some of them are dissonant and chromatic, some of them are upside down, some of them metamorphosize and grow just like that crocodile does. The girl of the title, Katya, This story is really fun. I'll digress here. She's randomly entrusted, but for some reason, she's randomly entrusted in her apartment with the care of various exotic creatures, including an African crocodile, but she comically loses them all. Getting the crocodile back teaches her lessons about the importance of looking after state property. Katya listens to her minders, and she earns a piece of cake as a reward. The message: disrespecting authorities invites trouble, heeding them has perks. Judging from Ustvolskaya's compositions in later life, this was not a moral that she herself respected. And so she was criticized for being original, which was a criticism. She's original, coldly speculative, yet no one doubted the fact that she was incredibly talented. She just wasn't interested in having pieces of cake from the authorities anymore. Last things I'll say before we actually get into what you're going to hear tonight, and I'll conclude, is she had opportunities in the 60s to earn a nice, comfortable life for herself by writing, political works. She actually said in an article that she was busy working on a piece for the 50th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution, which would have been 1967. That was reported, but no such piece exists. So either she destroyed it or was just telling a story or something else. There's mention, too, of the fact that she was interested in composing a piece representing the triumph of Soviet troops over the Nazis, but she chose not to exploit that particular point of national pride. She was 50 years old when she was talking about doing these things that she didn't do, and evidently she was no longer interested at this point in writing music that would please the establishment or maybe get her a bigger apartment or this and that. But she was protected. She was never targeted. The Leningrad Composers Union had an independent streak. The fact that she was disinterested in self-promotion served her well. And the most important thing for us, I think, is this is a composer who didn't want to be comprehended. Because if you're comprehended, that means you're instantly categorized. If you're comprehended, you can be controlled. If you're comprehended, you can be co-opted. So she embraced contradictions so as to move not merely outside, but truly beyond. And that's what those 6 piano sonatas are like. Contradictions. There's freedom and there's terror. There's the finite and then there's the infinite. And she plays games with us, like psychoacoustic games. You have to be part of these pieces as listeners. We can't just check out, because when you listen to long pieces of music, right? Third acts of opera particularly, you drift away, right? The ear tunes in, tunes out when you hear a lot of repetitions. Concentration is increased, it relaxes. In places, instead of honing in on individual pitches, the ear, our ear, is meant to listen to all of the reverberations underneath, undertones and then overtones when she strikes something high. So it's like she's really getting us to engage our rational selves. Not emotional. It's cerebral in this sense. And yet it's also physical. Painfully so at times. So she's focusing here on different bodies, that of the performer, that of that instrument, and us. So a usual binary we have is the mind and the body, right? Up here, down there. Logic and feeling. But she makes that a ternary. So you can't reduce this music to like the piano's form versus the body's form, pitches versus their vibrations. There's this sort of rational element to this music, but there's also an amazing dialogue, a sort of sympathetic resonance, so that this music, for all of its austerity and cerebral, becomes incredibly intimate without being sappily emotional. Okay. Couple of other remarks and then I'll part. She's been represented, again, I said this reductively, as a victim of a repressive society shut out from the world. The tragic suffering artist. She was the one who did the shutting out. She closed the door. She kept the world at a distance. God was in charge of her art, she said, but that's a banal thing to say. Hildegard of Bingen said that God was in charge of her art, if she could call it art. Prince said that about his rock music, right? But the idea of saying that God's in control sort of allowed her to actually establish this perception of absolute uniqueness. And yet, she couldn't negate everything, and she couldn't negate all context. There's still resonances with other composers. So you can say, well, there's no standard form here, or standard genre here, or style here. There's no real chords here. There's no keys here. There's no notation here that's familiar. There's no bar lines. But she still called the piano sonatas sonatas. They're not Stücke. They're not just things. And she still called her instrumental scores symphonies. One of the artists I like is a person named Robert Rauschenberg. Probably some of you know, and he created this thing called erased de Kooning drawing, which is, it's from 1953. It's a negative drawing. It's like an absence. It's like a drawing made by an eraser. If you can, that's her music. It's like a drawing made by an eraser. To erase is to eliminate, but in this case, it's to kind of pay a kind of tribute in a negative way. And so for her to say, Shostakovich wasn't an influence on me. This symphony is not about America. Those are negative relationships, but they're relationships nonetheless. And so even though she tried really hard to eliminate context from her works, even in the maximal nothingness, which she was aiming for, some context remained. And the context is hers, her radical individuality, her uncompromisingly unique sound. You hear this music and you don't know where it was made. There's no way of knowing. Okay, the last couple of things I'll say, and this is a fun quote. The Sixth Piano Sonata, which is the last one you're going to hear here, is like it's the one that's cited over and over again as associated with tragic suffering. It's bolstered her image as some sort of dissident in the West. And it's earned her a nickname. You hear it all the time, you read it all the time. The lady or woman with the hammer, or hammers. The lady with the hammers. Liner notes, scholarship, classical music sites, reviews. The Dutch critic and composer Elmer Schoenberger coined this phrase, and he's very proud of it. He's a fan of hers. But this is what he said about her life. He said she lived, the lady with the hammers, a dead-end life in a hermetically sealed world, every day in the lineup for bread and cabbage. And meanwhile, stubbornly notating sheet after sheet of manuscript paper, scribbling eventually when a tremor makes the handwriting nearly illegible, with music that is the only music that wants to be. No, this is the only music that must be written. But music no one is holding their breath for. Music that, if not denounced, will still be ignored. Music that you might never hear, and about which there's hardly anyone to talk about with. It's very bleak and very untrue. Her life was not a dead-end life. The lady with the hammer line actually works, but not in the way that he intended. It's not about the bashing, it's about power. For people like me, whenever you hear hammers in music, you think about Pythagoras. The anecdote about him, didn't happen. But he walks by a blacksmith shop, right, in Athena, and he hears hammers coming down of different weights, and he hears the intervals from them, and that comes up a system of consonances. But what I'm thinking here is the tale from the Bible of Yael. The Israelites are at war with the Canaanites. And there's a warrior named Deborah, and she says that the Canaanite commander Sisera, he's going to fall at the hands of a woman. And the general fleeing the battle finds himself outside Yael's tent. Yael invites him in, feeds him, and even guards him as he relaxes, but when he falls asleep, quote, she reached out her hand to the tent peg, her right hand to the laborer's hammer. She hammered Sisera. She smashed his head. She struck and pierced his temple through. Beneath her feet, he sunk, he fell, he lay. Beneath her feet, he sunk, he fell. Where he sunk, he fell there dead. Now, there are two accounts of this killing, prose version in Judges 4 and a poetic one in Judges 5, which is the one I'm quoting here. In both of them, Yael triumphs, but her motivation is never explained. She smashed down a lot, but her motivations are never explained. And she triumphed. And the only explanation comes from critics who have, since she died and even before, been struggling to define her art and her place in the canon. And her place in the canon is neither inside nor outside, but beyond. Okay. Thank you.
That was musicologist Simon Morrison talking about the music of the 20th century Russian composer Galina Ustvolskaya. Head over to otherminds.org to hear Conor Hanick's performance of Ustvolskaya's piano sonatas at the Freight Salvage in Berkeley on October 28th, 2024. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds in San Francisco. If you haven't already, be sure to check out our previous episodes featuring interviews with a range of composers, performers, and authors.